Welcome to this session. We're here to talk about areas of research interest and routes into policy making by researchers. We've got an absolutely fantastic panel. We kind of cover the whole kind of evidence use ecosystem, so we really, I think, are going to have a brilliant conversation. Before I introduce the panel, I always sort of think it's worth kind of thinking about what our intentions are, what our hopes are for the session that we're all going to kind of be engaging with. As you just heard, I'm based at UCL. I suppose I would describe myself as a knowledge mobiliser. So I'm kind of working with the academic community, thinking about how to mobilise evidence, mobilise knowledge into public policy. So for me, I'm always interested in kind of strategies, tips, tricks, how we can kind of basically move the conversation on and do our jobs more effectively. So I'm really hoping we can kind of get in to some of that today. We've got about 50 minutes together, so we're going to hear from our panel some sort of introductory remarks, helping to set the scene. Then we'll have a little bit of a conversation on the stage, before we open to audience Q&As. I would really ask that we ask questions rather than kind of give chapter and verse comments. Obviously, background is interesting, but just we've got quite a few people in the room, and it would be great to give everybody a chance to kind of ask a question. So, if you're okay, I'm actually going to ask you to introduce yourselves. Often, I've noticed people sort of look on LinkedIn, you know, it's maybe a little bit out of date and it doesn't quite say what you actually want to say about what your job and what your kind of role is here today. So I think it'd be really nice if you're happy to introduce yourselves and maybe give a sense of what your hope is for this session.
I'm Catherine Oliver. I am an academic, so I study evidence use and I've been very involved with the ARIs. I'm really hoping to hear how people are using ARIs at the moment, what could be improved, and what sort of support colleagues need in order to get the most out of them.
Good morning, my name is Daniel Robinson. I work for the Economic and Social Research Council as part of the Public Policy and Engagement team. I feel like I'm still learning about ARIs, even after all my involvement in them. Probably shouldn't say that, so it's a Catherine. You've not been paying attention. But no, still interested to learn how they're developing, how they're growing. And yeah, I mean, hopefully say something a bit of why we as both the ESRC, but also more widely why UKRI is interested and indeed has an indelible link to the ARIs.
Thank you. I'm Mike Daly. I work in the Department for Work and Pensions in our Central Analysis and Science Strategy Unit. Part of my role is building our external links with academia so that the department can benefit from the best evidence that is out there. And what I would hope to get out of this, I think, is in two directions. One is to give a further plug for the ARIs and make sure they're used, because there's a fair amount of effort goes into producing them. So we want people to use them, and also maybe to get some insights as to how we can use them better ourselves, because we're just in the process of producing a new one, and we want to make the most of it.
Great, so there's a real opportunity, I think, to think about how we can engage with the panel through our day jobs. Let's good way to kind of build networks. It's quite interesting. If I reflect on my career, I think I've been tracking ARIs in that I joined UCL in about 2014, just as kind of the Pool Nurse review was coming out. And I thought, who is Pool Nurse? What is this thing? I've moved into a new role. I'm suddenly hearing, is it ARIs? Is it ARIs? Is it something else? And so I think it would be really good to kind of understand a bit of the origin story, really, kind of what was the push and kind of pull factor for ARIs, and sort of what was their original intention and kind of hope. And I wonder, Daniel, if you wanted to take that from kind of a funder perspective.
Yeah, I'll think of it to start. I think Catherine and Michael both had things to add. So as I was sort of saying at the beginning, ARIs and UKRI have a shared genesis, and they both kind of emerged out of the original nurse review, say about 10 years ago. And with UKRI, it was previously then, you had the different research councils, and there's very much this idea that bringing research councils together would allow greater impact, greater collaboration across the research disciplines. With the ARIs, as I understand it, it was really about sort of actually trying to give a coherent and clear way for government to communicate what its R&D needs were. And it's kind of, I guess, the linking thing to sort of both of those, which is, if you look at this original nurse review and in the second nurse review that's come out, is this idea that ideas, expertise, insight, information, evidence should be able to flow between different sectors, between academia and government, and indeed the third sector, maybe might be here in Coram, and industry as well. And to bring some kind of coherency to those things. And it was a kind of a critical part of sort of really building on that infrastructure. I don't know if you guys want to add anything on? Yeah.
So, in a nutshell, what Paul Nurse was saying was it's going to be much easier for researchers to produce relevant research if government is able to say what it needs. So that's the sort of the very short version. And government departments did a good job in responding to that call. So it was made mandatory that every government department should produce them. We've just got the full set this year. I feel like I deserve a Blue Peter badge. I mean, I had nothing to do with it, but nevertheless. Anyway, no one's going to give me one. It's very sad. But every government department now produces areas of research interest. It takes about a year, 18 months, to go through the process of finding out what the different policy teams and directorates need, long-listing them, short-listing them, getting them signed off by the minister usually. But I think the process of going through, coming up with the ARIs for public consumption is incredibly useful for government departments. And increasingly we're seeing other bits of the public sector doing it as well, because it's seen as such a useful activity to help, for example, policy colleagues appreciate the value of evidence, bring some focus, direction and strategy to R&D, to engagement with universities and so on. And although the original intention was always that, Nurse's idea was that researchers would use them, and of course they do, they've got lots of other uses as well. So I think internally within government, for example, they've become a very useful way for different departments to recognise when they've got stuff in common. And they might be opportunities for collaboration around, we're doing an event on net zero, perhaps your colleagues would like to come, that sort of thing, or mutual learning in different ways. So I think the way I got involved was very a sort of really inspiring bit of public sector collaborations. What happened was by 2017, about half of government departments had produced them, and they were sitting on gov.uk in PDF, so not terribly accessible. But Jennifer Rubin, who at the time was the executive chair of ESRC, commissioned some analysis of them and spotted that about 80% of them were social science type questions. They'd require at least some sort of social science input to answer. Got very excited, approached Patrick Vallance, who at the time was the government chief scientist. He had a really big priority around building science capability within government, with helping government science departments articulate what they needed and get access to the evidence that they needed. And he saw the ARIs as being a critical cog in that. So together they put their heads together, and with the support of the Government Office of Science and ESRC, they decided to fund 2 knowledge mobilisers to go in and hang out in central government. That was me and Annette Boaz. We had the best time. It was supposed to be for a year, ended up being 4 years. We started December 2019. It all kicked off with COVID about 3 weeks later. It was very exciting. But where we're at now is a much better place. So it's not that the ARIs themselves are better, but everybody understands more about them. And including the research community. So one of the big messages that Annette and I talked about initially was that they're not research questions. These are not, questions which are indicating that there's an evidence gap. These are signals from government about what it is they want to know. And most of the time, we've got some evidence to share already. We can answer a lot of the questions. And one of the most exciting bits of work that I got to do with Go Science, who's represented here by Chrissy, who runs the ARI programme from within government, was to develop the ARI database, again funded by Go Science and ESRC, which pulls them all together off the PDFs, puts them in a searchable database so you can now find relevant questions as a researcher much more easily. So I think they're incredibly strategic there's a lot of incredibly strategic uses. We talk about them as being a sort of Swiss army knife. You know, they've got many different functions and roles, and I'd be excited to talk about some of them with you.
Thank you. So, first thing to say about the DWP experience with the ARI is that we had actually started that process before we'd heard of the nurse review. We should probably have heard of the nurse review earlier, but we hadn't. And we'd approached this for exactly the reasons that Catherine set out. It's so helpful to understand what are all our evidence gaps and to impose a discipline on people within the department, the policy customers and the analysts and researchers of thinking, what's it you really want to know and why do you want to know it? When, if you actually got an answer to this question, what would you actually do with it? And that's quite a useful process for getting people to focus on what they really need to know. And also to do some prioritisation. And we had got to the point where we thought we had something really useful internally, and we're thinking about publishing it and wondering whether we could persuade people internally that it would be a good idea to publish something, at which point Government Office for Science said, you must publish it, which was actually very much an open door for us. So that was great. When we put out our first version in 2018, we were, from the outset, we were determined to be proactive in engaging with academics about it. So we sent out a copy to a very long list of academic contacts and said, if you are interested in having a further discussion of this, do get in touch and let's see what we can set up. And that was the start of a series of ARI workshops that we've done with universities up and down the country. I think we've done something like 22 now, but that involves a lot more than 22 universities. UCL was one of the early ones. I think we met at that, Olivia? Yes, yes. And we very much see those as the start of a conversation. So, as Catherine says, these are not lists of research questions. It's not a consultation exercise where we just say, here are the questions we want answers to, please write in with your responses. It's not a funding call where we say, please tell us how much money you would like us to give you to answer these questions. It's the start of a conversation. And I think it's important for people to engage as early as possible. I think if people do engage early, so you're in the space of trying to tailor your research proposal so that it can be most useful to government users, rather than writing up a research proposal and then looking around for somebody who will sign at the bottom saying this is a great idea, then that kind of co-production is much more useful. I have got one specific example which I think is a nice one, from one of our first ARI workshops in 2018 with the University of Sheffield, and we were talking about things which it might be useful to explore. And in one of the discussion groups, they came up with the idea of algorithmic bias as something that it would be good to do some investigation of. Bear in mind, this was 2018, and on the back of that conversation and with some seed money from the university, we co-funded somebody to do a PhD on mitigation of algorithmic bias. And they have now finished the PhD and they're partway through a follow-on project with us, funded through the university's Impact Accelerator funding, to try and turn that PhD research into practical tools which we can use as we develop AI solutions. So, you know, that's my nicest example of something where you can sort of see bang, 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 you know, the impact. I mean, it's not usually as easy as that. A more indirect one, I guess, is the department has a methods advisory group, a diverse set of academics who try to make sure that we don't miss any tricks. And I don't know who we've appointed from the latest round of interviews, but I know that a number of the people who applied are people who have previously been in one of our ARI workshops and have thought, that sounds like something that I would like to get involved in. So there are multiple impacts, I would say.
Thank you. That was really interesting to kind of hear the origin story, the background, the development, and what difference they're making inside government departments. And you're absolutely right. My kind of reflection on those early DWP roadshows, where they were quite a game changer. Actually, UCL had pockets of engagement with DWP, but also some, I suppose, scepticism. There had been certain policy announcements which academics sort of didn't feel necessarily worked with the evidence. And actually, by bringing people together in the room and sort of talking about those choices and discovering them together and thinking about ARIs, it certainly helped to develop greater understanding and has built long-standing relationships which still exist today. So I think it was a really positive thing to do. Sort of sticking with sort of the long-term and the relationships, and I was having a chat with a colleague saying, you know, I'm going to be chairing this session, and we were sort of talking about it, and they kind of said, you know, in a slightly grumpy fashion, ARIs are sort of all well and good. They've definitely kind of built up a lot of interest, but actually don't we just need to get on with the action of kind of academic policy engagement? Don't we need to kind of get on with the doing rather than kind of the conversations around? So I'd be interested to know what your response might be, and especially given that often we've got people in the room that are interfacing with academics and might get that pushback about why should we engage. I think it's quite helpful to be able to have some thoughts on that.
I've had a number of conversations about this recently, and I think the simple answer is impact, which comes from two areas. I've had a long-standing view that the overwhelming majority of academics I've come across who work in the social sciences have gone into the field because they actually want to do something which makes the world a better place, rather than just something to pay the mortgage and keep them out of mischief. So people do their research and they want to see it applied. They want to make a difference to the world. And you're not going to do that without engaging with policymakers. And the other aspect of it, of course, is the ref. That, you know, being and associated activities, being able to demonstrate that your research has had some kind of impact on the real world, which, as we know, is very rarely I said they did type of impact, but at least being able to evidence that you've engaged with policymakers and you've been part of the conversation and your evidence has at least been listened to. So I think that's where the doing comes from, and that's why the knowledge exchange is so important.
I think the conversation is the doing. You know, I think that's where the work happens. It's in trying to understand each other. It's asking questions, it's hearing from each other. You're very, very rarely going to get a citation in a policy document that says, oh, you know, we spoke with such and they sent me all their papers and I read them all and, you know, we've decided to change our mind. That's not really how it works. The conversation is how it works. And, you know, those of us who've been in the game a long time know that that's sometimes really difficult for academic colleagues to make time for. It's not really seen as part of our jobs to go around talking to each other, bizarrely, even though that is actually how we operate as human beings. But for me, what the ARIs do, and they don't capture everything, but they do send out really strong signals about what you want to have a conversation about this. It's an open door. And while academics, it's true, do want to have impact, the number one factor which predicts your work having impact is relevance. And you cannot understand relevance until you've had a conversation about what they really want to know. And the ARIs are, you know, they're a window into that, but you have to go through the door and have the chat first.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think there's a sort of maybe almost an equity element to it as well, which is we know that effective knowledge exchange is a two-way thing. It's, again, it's conversation, and it's also very much based on trust and building trusted relationships. So that's really important. It's very, very clearly relational, but you then got the kind of the challenges. If it's very relational, how do you make sure it happens in a way that is open, fair, transparent? It's not just the same usual suspects. So I think things like the ARIs, the ARI database are vital for providing that sort of infrastructure that provides a bit of transparency, but also provides a new way in for individual academics or organisations who maybe, again, to Mike's point, want to see their research kind of feed into, say, for example, public policy, but don't have those existing connections. So I think it's important to have them, the two elements of that kind of environment.
Absolutely, and that certainly stands for broader parts of the system. Obviously, it's not just academics that can email or get in touch with ARI holders. We've been talking, I suppose, about the database, and I obviously don't know how many people in the room know what that is, as it were. So I wondered if we could have sort of outline, sort of, you know, once you become aware of ARIs, what's the way to engage? What is the database? How does that help us? What are some of the other kinds of tools? And maybe what's best practice in how you go about making those first steps?
Well, I'll kick off. So the original idea behind the ARI database was just to put everything in one place, because, I mean, this is sadly not a joke, but Annette and I were spending a lot of time printing out PDFs, cutting them up, and then organising them into themes, going, oh, look, these 3 departments. So
There's photographs.
there are photos of us doing it. So we've decided to put it into a database, but we were very fortunate that we were given some financial support from ESRC and Go Science to do it. So we could work with the colleagues from Overton. Do you guys know about Overton? So they know a lot about databases and structures of, you know, how to organise data and that kind of thing. And working with Ewan is such a fun thing, because you can say to him, what if we put all of the ARIs into one place? What do you think we could do? And he'd just sort of go away and think about it for about 3 months and then come back and say, I think we could match them with all the grants from UK ARI database. I'm like, really? That would be so cool. So now you can search them by department. You can have a look at the old ones and the new ones, because they tend to be refreshed every couple of years. And so you can look at things over time, you know. Government portfolios tend not to change all that much. So for science policy nerds like me, that's quite a fun thing to do. You can also look at, you know, which departments share interests. So as a university, you could be much more strategic and say, we've noticed that you 3 departments are all interested in X. Could we do some convening for you? Here's an evidence synthesis that we've pulled together. Here's a briefing. If you'd like to come and talk to us, like a roadshow, you know, we can organise that on your behalf. So I think there's lots of really, you know, helpful things you can take from it, as well as being a sort of structured database. There's also, of course, the Go Science has got its own tool, and they support all of government departments to set up their engagement mechanisms, and increasingly things like the Science Advisory Councils, fellowship schemes, secondments, all the other things that Go Science helps support are organised around areas of research interest, so they're seen as a focus for that sort of activity too. So I would say best practice as a researcher is, you know, see where your research might be relevant, and I would encourage you all to go and have a look at it anyway, because it's just quite fun to play with. But also, you know, have a look behind the database. So you can always go back to the original government websites where they've got the full document. That tends to have a bit more detail in there about what the policy background is. There's nearly always a contact detail as well, so you can get in touch with people directly and say, you know, I'm interested in, or I've got something to share about X, Y, Z.
I was just very briefly to echo what Catherine said. I mean, have a play. I mean, it's incredibly well designed. It's fascinating, particularly for us. Selfishly, the thing is seeing where the ARIs match to research that we've already funded, and I think that's. I mean, it's very exciting for us, because it's suddenly realised that there's some of these research questions, you know, ARI questions, that actually the research is there that could already partially answer them. So it was hugely exciting. There's a tremendous opportunity for some very early wins there, which is great. But also, I think it's interesting for us in identifying kind of some of the, where there might be some of the gaps. I think particularly as a research funder, that's one of the things we're looking at, almost kind of feeding into our kind of strategic overview of actually where are there some gaps, where should we be prioritising. So I think the potential uses are already very much kind of developing beyond sort of the initial kind of scope.
And certainly, as Catherine says, start with the database. I think that's a great place to go. Not just because you can find the multiple departments, but for quite a lot of people, actually finding out which single department is responsible for an area of policy can be quite surprising. So I think there's a tendency within DWP to imagine that everybody knows what we do. That's not actually the case. Some of the things we do are surprising, so we've got to some people. We have a responsibility for reducing parental conflict, for instance. Go away. I'm really sorry about this. Sorry about that. There's always one, isn't there? I blame Michael for not telling people to turn their phones off when they started. So we have a responsibility for reducing parental conflict, which is not necessarily something you would automatically assume that DWP does. We don't have a responsibility for employment rights legislation. That sits with Department for Business and Trade. So actually, as an individual academic, if you want to know who might be interested in your work, if you're looking at the individual ARIs, you might be going to 3 or 4 or 5 and still not find the right one. So start with the database. That's what I would say as individual researchers. As people who support researchers, I would say make sure everybody knows about it, because very often when I mention it to people, I see their eyes light up and just think, that sounds really interesting, why didn't I know about that? And I was at an event last year, I think it was, where I mentioned this to a group of people, and I saw one academic get his phone out and he was fumbling away, and he said to me afterwards, if the only thing I got out of coming to this session this morning was finding out about the database, that would have made it worth my while. It's not going to get used by people who don't know it's there. So I would encourage you to get the word out there.
I was going to very briefly, just again, that kind of cross-cutting thing. One of the things that's very interesting from an ESRC point of view, or UKRI point of view rather, is that sometimes you'll look up a research question and realise the relevant research to that doesn't come from a single research council. So again, it's looping back to that whole kind of Paul Nurse thing about actually why was UKRI created, because actually policy challenges very rarely sit in neat disciplinary buckets. So that's been an interesting sort of challenge to us as well. So.
Sorry. And just to say, we've just been given some more funding to develop the database a bit further. So we're also looking at including ARIs from other bits of the public sector and internationally, so local government, devolved administrations. Obviously, there's all sorts of opportunities for collaboration across different levels and internationally. So, you know, the sky's the limit.
And I think the website is ari.org.uk. Yep. So note that down and definitely do check it out. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll turn to the audience. So do have a think about what it is you'd like to ask the panellists. I also have found that database really transformational, not only to understand where research is happening. So if you're thinking about convening roundtables on particular topics, thinking about bringing expertise that doesn't necessarily sit within your own institution, it's really helpful for that too, as well as the other kind of points that you've made. But Catherine, you just touched on, I suppose, this sort of burgeoning or growing ARI agenda and, you know, starting in national government, but we know we've got them in Parliament for scrutiny, we've got them kind of coming down the track in the kind of regional government space. So I'd just be, I suppose, interested to pick up on that last point and understand a bit more about how maybe that is kind of integrating into the national system. You've mentioned hopefully into the database, but I suppose also, you know, how do people sort of continue, you know, what's your sort of thoughts about how it's going to change the system in the future, I suppose, with ARIs kind of having this broader reach?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that not all ARIs are the same, and that's absolutely okay. Within government, if you look at them, some of them look really different. You know, the old Home Office ones are kind of my favourite. One of them was just drugs. That was the whole thing. But when you talk to them and you get to know the policy team, there's really good reasons as to why that is the entirety of the ARI. Other departments where perhaps there's lots and lots of scientists involved and they're employed directly by a department, for example, they look much more like a research agenda and they articulate questions and topics on which they are seeking research activity. Others are not trying to do that. What they all have in common is that they're trying to bring a bit of transparency to their research and engagement needs. So I think if we understand them all under that very broad umbrella, that's a very helpful starting point. So the reason I say that is because the local government, regional government and other parts of the public sector and increasingly the third sector, of course, don't have access to the incredible expertise and support offered by the Government Office of Science, which has a dedicated team to do that. That's not to say that they're not as good. Everybody's just approaching it in a different way, in a way that makes sense for their own local setting. So, for instance, I was talking to some local government colleagues just yesterday, and they tend to have much less capacity within local government, people whose job it is to think about data and evidence. So you might take a real step-by-step approach of taking one policy team. When they've seen the value of it, then you can move on to the next. So you might start in one area and build out. And I think that's a perfectly okay process. No one's saying that they have to be of a certain standard, because everybody's on a journey to understand what's most useful and how to work most helpfully with each other. I think that's what I would say about it. But I think more transparency in general is a good thing. And from a data perspective, it's not like it's exciting to see the insights about who's funding what and what's relevant, but it's not a performance management exercise, and it's not an evaluation exercise either. It's really it's come from a much more positive place than that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I just maybe picking up or following on from that point. I mean, it's fantastic technology. It doesn't give you the answer. It tends to kind of put a little flag and go, look here, there's something interesting going on. And I think for us, we touched on these already. One is this idea that already so many of these questions that are being published by government departments can at least partly be answered by research that already exists. So it's a really interesting question challenge to us, which is that's fantastically exciting. But why isn't it happening?
Is it?
What's going on here? So there's that's something I think we're sort of chewing over, and again, it's sort of a case of we need to look at more deeply about why is the connection not being made yet, and what could we do as part of the infrastructure to support that? And again, the other one is where are there gaps? And again, this is very much as things continue to emerge, as more and more ARIs get developed, they get refreshed. Just sort of understanding, well, actually, are there any kind of critical gaps? Or really, actually, we need to be thinking about this at UKRI in terms of our planning and our strategy, to make sure that we're sort of supporting research in those areas.
And to add to that, I think one thing which is particularly interesting in DWP at the moment, as I'm sure all you will know, we are going through a process of devolving a lot more power to local areas, initially the mayoral strategic authorities to deliver some of the services, which will mean that they will have more need of evidence in those areas than they have had before, because previously policies have actually been delivered directly by central government, or central government has told them what they have to do. So their need for evidence on that might be less. So now they're going to need more and more evidence. I think as they do, and as they start producing their ARIs, if every local authority in the country produces an ARI, there's going to be an awful lot of overlap, and that's a huge amount of material for anybody to try and wade through without having a database which organises it nicely for you. I think just responding to the question about the gaps and why aren't questions being answered, I think the types of questions that come up in social policy particularly are ones which tend not to have a definitive answer. So if you think about drugs, for instance, what might work to support people who have got a drug use problem. There is a lot of evidence out there, but that is still going to be something which concerns us for years to come. So just because there's lots of evidence doesn't mean we don't need more evidence. But I think the task of researchers designing new projects, as it always is you start off by looking at what is the existing body of knowledge and what can I do which will add materially to that rather than just producing something which just repeats what people already know.
Great, thank you. That role of evidence in decision making is very, very, very interesting, and it's really good to kind of like remove the black box around that, in the sense of that, you know, evidence can help to lead to options, but ultimately, you know, we've got ministers and other parts of the machinery needing to make those decisions. So it'd be really great to, you've obviously sat here patiently waiting, listening to everyone. It'd be really great to get some audience questions. And I see you put your hand up straight away. I'll take a couple. Is there a microphone? And if not, I'll run over.
Thanks very much. First of all, really exciting as somebody who's literally just taken on responsibility for policy engagements. So to find about this now couldn't be more timely. Just a couple of hopefully quick questions. I mean, first of all, I mean, it's a brilliant idea, and I love the self-service element in the sense that we can just guide academics, but they can look after themselves to an extent as well. But academics can probably get quite demoralised if they send out emails and questions and perhaps don't always get any responses. So I'm obviously appreciated there might be lots of emails. Is there some kind of target that you have in terms of getting back, responding to as many requests as possible in the government departments? And a quick second question, just from a quick look at the database. I'm looking at the Department for Work and Pensions ones, and all the ARI seem to be from 2023, and the Home Office ones are from 2019. Should academics still apply, answer questions that are sort of that old, or does it come a point where they think perhaps these are out of date?
Okay, I'll let you mull on those, and I'll just take a couple. I think there was some here.
Oh, hi, my name's Lisa. I'm the Press and Research Communications Manager at City St George's. My question is more about being able to support researchers able to kind of go from, you know, they're doing the laboratory research, but they actually want to have a bigger impact. Obviously, we've got the Ref 29 coming up, and I suppose one of the things I'm thinking about is, you know, being able to show your impact. And some of our researchers are very good at being able to get in front of government, policymakers, but other ones, that might be a journey that they want to start. So obviously, from my perspective, it's really interesting hearing about the database, because I wasn't aware of that before. But if I've got a researcher who's, I don't know, got some really interesting research, could, you know, answer or, you know, very relevant to one of these ARIs, what's like how do they go about kind of then actually being able to get involved in the policy making stuff? I suppose I'm coming from the other side of that, of actually, yeah, how did researchers make that leap, aware that the database exists, but how do we navigate it from there? Yeah, a bit of a broader question, I suppose, but something I'm keen as a communications manager.
Hi, I'm Rachel from Royal Holloway, University of London, and I manage the Social Science Impact Accelerator grant that we have. I think kind of connected to your question, thinking about sort of the timeliness of when we should contact the email addresses provided, like under the bios of the ARIs. Is that something that we should be doing, you know, at the point where maybe I identify an academic who's working on an area of interest and pursuing an impact project? Or should we contact you guys once the impact project is complete, so we can say, here you go, here's the impact that we've attempted to sort of engage with?
Thank you. So we've got questions there on how up to date and how relevant are the ARIs, you know, how and when to support people on their engagement journey, at what point, and how do we kind of make the leap from understanding there's an ARI there to actually getting in front of a government official.
Thanks. Those are all great questions. I think I've got answers to all of those, for DWP at least. So for answering emails, if you look at our ARI, there is an email address, evidence.strategyteam@dwp.gov.uk, and one of the teams in my unit monitors that email, and I think we can pretty much guarantee that there will be a response. There is a certain amount taking a horse to water in there. What we can do is we can say we know who in the department is responsible for that particular issue, and we can put you in touch with them, but we can't necessarily force them to engage further. But at least you will get some. It won't just disappear with a dull thud. On the out-of-date ARIs, I mean, we are in the process of refreshing ours. As I said, we were actually thinking about it at the start of last year, but something happened about July, I think, which meant we kind of stopped and thought again about what our questions are. But to be honest, I think Catherine said a lot of these things are quite persistent. So one of the things which has featured in all our ARIs to date is some version of what are the best ways to help people with mental health problems to get in and remain in work. And that's been a live research question for the last 25 years, to my personal knowledge. And I doubt whether we will get to the stage in any of our lifetimes where we say, actually, we've got that one cracked. So these things are not likely to disappear immediately. But in any case, first thing to do is just reach out, get in touch. If you've got any doubts, just say, we've seen this question, we think we've got something to say, but before I do any work, can you just tell me, are you still interested? So that's easy enough. How to go about getting involved? Well, again, for us, we have got that central contact point, so you can reach out to that. I would always encourage people to do a little bit of reading around the subject. So, for example, you can look on the DWP website and you can see that we've published a white paper on Get Britain Working. We've got a welfare reform bill, which you might have heard of recently, which is caused some interest in the last week or so. So knowing about what we're doing and what our policy areas are is always a good start. So you come across as engaged. But yeah, just get in touch and say, can we have a chat? It should be fairly straightforward. And when to get in touch? I think as early as possible. I think setting about a project to say we want to accelerate, improve the impact of this research and finish it, and then go around to people and say, is that something that you think will be useful? Is not going to be as good as saying, we want to do something in this space, tell us what we should try and concentrate on to make it as useful as possible.
Great. It's my poor timekeeping, so I'm going to see if we can take another round of questions. I would just say as well, please don't email screeds and screeds of academic papers and things like that. It's definitely best to get your email succinct and say, shall we have a chat? And that's when you can then do the follow-up. Right, let's see if we can take further three questions.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Rosalie. I'm from the Oxford Policy Engagement Network. And I just wanted to ask a question, mainly from DWP, about how the end user uses them. You talked about policy customers, I think was a great term. I think when you're talking to researchers and convincing them to submit work to ARIs, some of the questions we get are, how are they going to be used? Who's reading them? Policy analysts, or, do MPs read them? We get that question quite a bit. Do MPs read them? And kind of just knowing a little bit about some kind of qual or quant evidence as to how the ARIs then result in, actual, I might be too much to say policy change, but I think it would be great to know about the journey of an ARI after it's been submitted and how it gets used in government policy.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I'm Christian Cohen from the Open University, and we're very much enjoying at the moment working with DWP Getting Britain Working, we're doing the Momentum campaign, trying to encourage mothers to return to the workplace, and other parents and care providers, I hasten to add, but with an emphasis on parents. But since last July, we've been hearing a lot about Skills England. And I was wondering whether that has an impact on the way in which departments interact with one another, and if that in them will have a ripple effect on us, or should we sort of kind of almost ignore Skills England's integrated approach for now and just use the familiar mechanisms that we've got in place already, if that makes sense.
Thanks. So we had two questions there. The last one on sort of engagement approaches. Who do we choose to engage with first? That's how I've kind of interpreted that question. And then one more so on evaluation. How do we know engaging is actually making a difference? How can we evidence, kind of that this engagement has led to something?
I don't mind taking that one. So I think everybody's been on a bit of a journey, around engagement with policy over the last 10 years anyway. And, Liv and I have talked about this many times over the last however many years it is, not too many. But I think one of the critical things that this part of the university infrastructure does is help manage academics' expectations and understand what a realistic engagement looks like. It's very rarely going to look like an email you've got back going, well, thank you, that was very helpful. Hearing about your single project helped us change our minds, and that's gone into the bill, and the minister's delighted he'll be sending it. That's not ever going to happen. So it's much more likely that, an email that says, how can we help, is going to get you into a conversation. As far as I'm concerned, and I say that as Professor of Evidence and Policy, that is impact. Being part of a conversation, engaging with the policy process, that is often that is indication of impact in my book. That's proof to me that the work that researchers are doing is being useful and being used. It's you're never really going to get quantitative evidence that things are changing on the ground, or population level outcomes are changing. So I think managing academics' expectations and helping them to understand that an offer of help is going to be much more appreciated than I'd like to thank you for my lovely research, is a really critical job that UPenn have been instrumental in pushing those messages. I was
going to say very briefly, go back to one of the previous questions around the sort of support that's available. Obviously, we've talked about the ARI database. I think there are some very useful, more general sort of kind of policy engagement resources that people can access. So I think about some of the kind of the Cape Legacy stuff that's very helpful. UPenn's. There's also some work that NERC and ESRC did together around policy engagement training, and that's now available as a free online resource. And then there's kind of more sort of formal programs for people sort of who want to kind of go down this route maybe in a more involved way. So I head up the UKRI Policy Fellowships call, which closes in about 6 days, I think. So it might be a bit tight to the wire, but I would say have a look at those. And we've seen a sort of tremendous impact that schemes like that have had. Again, really about giving people sort of the opportunity to have first-hand experience of going. So in that case, from academia to working in a policy-making environment, and that almost that kind of, oh, right, this is what it's like, and suddenly realising what it is that they then have to do to communicate their research in the way that makes it accessible, makes it relevant. And so we've got another call that's applications are going to be coming out later in the year. The award will be later in the year, and that's really around the almost the mirror of that, actually getting people out from policy-making environments and giving them a chance to sort of work alongside research communities. So do keep a look out for that as well.
Interesting what I can usually add to that. Picking up the question about who to talk to, there's a couple of things which occur to me on that. One is that you're potentially demonstrating the power of the point I made just now about knowing the background. So you can contact DWP and in your succinct email say, but I'm aware that Skills England are active in this place part as well. Should I contact them? And then at least you immediately come across as somebody who knows what they're talking about. It won't be quite as responsive maybe, but if you go into the ARI database and look at who has put questions down about skills, you will see that DWP and Department of Education have both got questions about skills. So that's a clue as well. In terms of where it actually goes to, And there is actually, I'm not sure whether it has closed yet. There was an application out for somebody to go and work in Go Science, I think it was, to research impact of policy engagement activities. So it's an interest for us as well, because we spend a fair amount of time going out and organising workshops, and me coming to an event like this. And sooner or later somebody will say, what has actually come from this? Has it actually generated anything useful? And that's quite hard, because when research is published, the acknowledgements will not generally say, we are deeply grateful to DWP for issuing areas of research interest which prompted this study. So we won't be able to say what research has come about as a result of our ARIs. But what happens is that research is used. It's used in some fairly formal ways. I was talking to somebody about this yesterday. When bids are made for major investment in the periodic spending reviews, all those bids have to be supported by a summary of the evidence. And if there is relevant evidence from academia that we know about, that will go in there to say, this study shows that this would be an effective thing to do. So I don't know if that answers the question. It does get in there. In DWP, generally speaking, because of the way we are set up, most of the direct interaction will be with analysts and researchers working in policy teams rather than the policymakers themselves. And they also act as an intermediary. So they're not a barrier, they are a way of making sure that we can extract from the external research what are the things which really matter for our policy and get those in front of the right people.
Just very quickly, most of the ARIs, as we've said several times, a really useful response to it is going to be a roundtable, a discussion, an evidence briefing, that kind of thing. So I don't think researchers always need to think about how can I tell government about it. Sometimes you can just find out about what's going on in your university or within your research community and try and join in with those sorts of activities as well. The impact of those sorts of things are very hard to evidence, and it's great that Go Science is taking a lead on looking at that. We do have a very small amount of data now about cases where areas of research interest published by government have been cited in research proposals, fellowship proposals, that have led to papers that have been cited again in policy documents. So we've got a few examples of that, and they're starting to come out more. It's really a timing thing, because obviously they've been around really for about 8 years. So we're seeing more of those coming out the woodwork, but those are very exciting when we spot them. But they're always going to be in the minority of cases.
Well, I found this session hugely fascinating. I can see that the next room hasn't quite finished, but we are absolutely at time. And I think you've got a short break next, so obviously want to make sure that people can get refreshments and have a comfort break. Thank you ever so much. I think you've been really generous with your insights and your thoughts, and certainly my hope for the session about kind of strategies and ways to engage and things to take forward has certainly been realised. I hope it has for the audience too. So I think we should give all of ourselves a big round of applause, and to the panel.